Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our conference, 100 Years of Ranajit Guha, revisiting his life and works. We are starting a little late today, but I hope you don't mind that. Our first session today is a lecture by Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. I'm sure none of us here needs any introduction to Professor Spivak, but by ways of a formality, I'll speak a few words before we hear her lecture, which has been sent to us in pre-recorded form. So unfortunately, we will not be able to take any questions or comments after this session. Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak is University Professor at the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and a founding member of Columbia's Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. A proponent of practical deconstructivist feminist Marxist position, Spivak gained international recognition with a translation and extended introduction of Jacques Derrida's of Grammatology. Before joining Columbia University in 1991, Spivak taught at numerous universities, including Brown University, Paul Valery, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Goethe Institute, Frankfurt, etc., and held the Andrew W. Mellon Professorship of English at the University of Pittsburgh. Can the Subaltern Speak is perhaps her best-known essay. And apart from this, the critique of post-colonial reason towards the history of a vanishing present is considered Spivak's first full treatment of post-colonial studies, a field that she, quote-unquote, helped define. Other books by Spivak include Death of a Discipline, Other Asias, and Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization, and Dubois and the General Strike. Among her more recent articles are General Strike, Crimes of Identity, Our World, etc. Professor Spivak has also written to a great extent in Bangla, and today we'll hear her lecture in short order. So, thank you.
I am most grateful to Ranajit Guha for having drawn me into his intellectual journey. And I thank Shohini Sengupta and Saurabh Chattopadhyay for inviting me to participate in this tribute to express that gratitude, however inadequately. I thank Surya Parekh, Luca Arens, and Sophia Ho for helping put these words together in a time full of death, accidents, and obligations, bureaucratic and otherwise. Ranajit Guha is an exemplary initiator of the new international. Let me explain. One of the tragedies of our century was that the Internazionale did not save the human race. As Gramsci understood, Capital Volume 1 was written with a working class man or a reading group comprised of working men and working women as implied readers for an epistemological change that could confront capitalism as a system, although in the short term, quote, the shortening of the working day was the grounding condition. In Capital Volume 1, Marx repeatedly emphasizes the need for the worker to internalize that labor power is an abstract average stream, not a collectivity formed by many individual labors. Although individual suffering is extremely important, emphasis only on that victimage will not allow the international working class to confront international communism. Marx seems aware of the importance of giving the ill or uneducated working class access to the capacity to abstract, generalize, think, imagine the average. Marx also shows awareness of the discontinuities generated by so-called uneven development. His own systemic thinking, however, could not accommodate even the extra exploitative capitalist. I quote, "Indeed, the capitalist may push the wage of the worker down below the value of his labor power, despite the important role which this method plays in the effective movement of wages. It is excluded here by the prerequisite that all commodities, including labor power, are bought and sold at their full value." In his Spectres of Marx, 1993, Derrida, with a somewhat closer experience of the discontinuity between imperial master, France, and subject nation, Algeria, than Marx, proposes a new international. As in the case of Ranajit Guha, his arena of the production of collectivity is the classroom. How many are we, is asked again and again. In my own case, it worked out this way. A single teacher's students flung out into the world and time is a better real-world example of the precarious continuity of a Marxism to come, much more aligned to the lines of global activism today, in the aftermath of 1989, in the hot peace after the Cold War. Today, as the Cold War and the turbulence of the post-1989 legacy has given way to an incipient world war on a new model, the formula seems even more apposite. My encounter with Ranajit Guha has certainly had a similar effect. A single teacher's students flung out into the world and time, where the classroom is the model for the building of collectivity. My proposals to organizations such as the Comparative and International Education Society, an influential worldwide organization that has been around since 1956, and the World Economic Forum, must acknowledge this influence, the influence of these two men, Guha and Derrida. Let me cite a couple of sentences from these longer speeches. I quote, "To notice spiritual connections on paper is not sufficient preparation for real affirmative sabotage. Therefore, I will suggest a general structure as the agency of our permanent, perhaps persistent is a better word, permanent and persistent revolution. A worldwide educational initiative inclusive of ceaseless teacher training on a thoroughly decentralized cellular model and an ongoing effort to keep it that way. My feminist influences were received elsewhere and on another methodical model, but that consideration is irrelevant here. I will only mention Jean Franco, 10 months younger than Guha, whose fierce criticism of the gendering of liberation theology, of Latin American indigenous movements, and her clear distinction between Latin American and South Asian colonialisms has taught me a fearless feminism. Jean died last night, and I dedicate these few remarks to her. As for the ways in which subaltern women show the limits to metropolitan feminism, that cannot be broached here. Guha's moving attempt to show, I quote, the politics of patriarchy in rural Bengal in Chandra's death misses this lesson by defending women's solidarity in the Dubrajpur district by way of Simone de Beauvoir. Although 1849 and 1998 to 2022 are not comparable, I can say that I have lived with Bagdi women of Dubrajpur, Bhavanipur, Khairashol, and Rajnagar district, the places on Guha's map. I've lived with them. On the powerful side, this essay does show that caste is in the nooks and crannies of Guha's subalternist approach, since he has often been accused of ignoring caste. That Guha's influence is immediately recognizable in the field of descriptive historiography is tangential to my argument about the New International. Indeed, as he claims, the documents attesting to Chandra's death for history, he claims them for history. I may say that I claim him for the humanities, the practice of learning to learn from below, supplementing the restoration of that below for authoritative historiography. It had seemed a long time ago that the Subaltern Studies Collective questioned Eric Hobsbawm's description in 1956 of, I quote, banditry of the Robin Hood type, rural secret societies, various peasant revolutionary movements of the millenarian sort, pre-industrial urban mobs and their riots, some labor religious sects, and the use of ritual in early labor and revolutionary organizations as pre-political. Apparently, the objection to Hobsbawm's position was much more deep-seated than I had imagined. For in 2012, Guha's objection is taken beyond Hobsbawm, who can hardly be called either elitist or fatuous, and he specifically apologizes, Hobsbawm does, for not considering areas outside of Europe. Here is Guha in 2012, I quote, most of the complexities in South Asian history derive from the urgency with which our approach insists on the recognition of such entities and forces of civil society as are usually left out in the cold by elitist studies of politics. The analysis and description of power in colonial India, we argue, must no longer rely on the fatuous concept of the pre-political. Gayatri Spivak, certainly appreciate the fact that Hobsbawm called such movements primitive forms of social agitation. Guha saw them as synchronic, though with different diachronies. That is the way I think the simultaneity of the global. I've said this again and again. I have learned to put Guha with such an unusual thinker as René Mercado Zavaleta of Bolivia, who thought of post-colonial societies as motley and felt that each group therein achieved its own place in the modern in its own way. Yet I must also say that, as I explained on the 20th anniversary of my essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, that my source for understanding the subaltern's inability to be comprehended by the elite was Marx's 18 Brumaire, where Marx says that small plot peasants, I'm quoting, small plot peasants could not make their class interest count, geltend zu machen. Small plot peasants could not make their class interest count. I felt in Can the Subaltern Speak that Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri could not make her resistance count as such, and that the elite must learn how to complete her speech act. I presented the first version of the essay in 1983 before I met Mr. Guha. I added the word subaltern to the text after my meeting with him in 1984. I had been teaching Gramsci since the 60s. I believed that Gramsci, understanding Marx's self-perceived task to be epistemological, as I have said above, or gnosiological, as Gramsci said in Italian, producing activist gnosis in the collectivity, concentrated on the production of the subaltern intellectual, where the subaltern's environment was the new revolutionary communist intellectual's instructor. Neither Marx nor Gramsci had the slightest bit of primitivism. This is where I was able to place the unique work of Ranajit Guha, how he learned to listen to the subaltern, feeling strong, being in the humanities, and thus trained to teach the practice of learning by learning to surrender to fiction, thus strengthening the ethico-political reflex. I have described how I received this training from Taraknath Sen and Paul de Man, and indirectly from attending to Derrida in various recent writings. Under Guha's guidance, the subaltern was on the way to being heard in history. Chandra's death was once again the text. So I went into producing the subaltern intellectual. That has been my work. I understood this interdisciplinarity later, working with Romila Thapar, especially on what became her account of the movement from lineage to state and the stunning book on Somnath. She was unafraid of the power of the humanities, secure as a historian. I came to a much fuller realization of how the humanities could supplement historiography most robustly as I worked much more closely with Hari Vasudevan on a project called Radiating Globality. Hari was a brilliant historian whose field was rather far from subaltern studies, although he was certainly most appreciative of the work. I should say, when I say supplementing humanities, supplementing historiography, that briefly a supplement questions the totality of any system and keeps filling a specific blank therein, here, fiction in the general sense. I was able, in my tribute to Hari, entitled Radiating Globality, working with Hari Vasudevan, to comment extensively on how history and the fiction underived as an antonym from truth can get together at the border crossing of firm disciplinary epistemologies. Disciplinary historians, however, were troubled by the introduction of the literary into the writing of history. I just skimmed a literary representation of the subaltern in Subaltern Studies, Volume 5, and saw how sure I was of my ground, that the imagination is larger than the individual's intention, that the point is not only to control through intelligence, but also to learn to surrender, a prayer to be haunted. Rajat Rai's inability to understand this is representative of the general alarm, a refusal of interdisciplinarity. I will just quote it here to give you a sense of the outrage. Mr. Guha himself might have come to regret his invitation to me, although his own work was much more subtle than what Ray submits. Here, I quote Rajat Rai. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's subaltern construction of Mahashita Devi's story Stanodayini was publicly controverted by the author herself at the Second Subaltern Studies Conference in Calcutta on 9th January 1986. The exploited wetness of her story, it appears, was not a symbol of the subaltern at all, but a symbol of Mother India. The critic in this instance found the author's interpretation as, quote, not very useful from the perspective of a study of the subaltern, and set it aside on account of its affinity with a militant nationalism. The procedure is bound, Rajat writes, the procedure is bound, however, to cause some public amusement, and a historian will be well advised to skirt round such pitfalls. For my part, he continues, Rajat Rai, for my part, I will not read anything into a story not consciously intended by the author. Shelley's reading of Paradise Lost would get a failing grade from Professor Rai. Partha Chatterjee, Shahid Amin, Shail Bairam, Dipesh Chakravorty, and others found the idea of historiography in the literary more than acceptable, perhaps even related to Gramsci's notion that the historiography of the subaltern has to be episodic and fragmented. I commented at the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the elementary aspects of peasant insurgency at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi on Guha's perception that religion could bring subalternity to crisis and become the subaltern's access to the public sphere. W.E.B. Du Bois had the same intuition, which is best expressed in the chapter entitled The Coming of the Lord in his study of the Black Reconstruction in America, where he shows how the enslaved understood emancipation as the second coming. The coming of the Lord. I should like to think that this was also the perception of the Enlightenment Ambedkar. There are many Ambedkars. The Enlightenment Ambedkar regarding Buddhism, and that he would have come round to this more carefully than in his comparisons of Marxism and Buddhism, if there had been any time in his life at all after his conversion, although generalizations on this score cannot be used before a thorough study of Savita Ambedkar's Baba Sahib, My Life with Dr. Ambedkar. It has been noticed, as I pointed out, that in the subalternist's work, there is no overt consideration of caste, although Chandra's death, as I have also pointed out, would give this the lie. It is as if in their work, caste is pre-comprehended as something that would not allow them to look at what subalternity could achieve in spite of caste. I would like to suggest that if the work of Ranajit Guha inspires some, at least, into the activity on the New International in the Indian context, this would bring forth an acknowledgement of the working reality of caste, not only from top down, but also within the subaltern groups, as in my own case, in the interest of what Ambedkar has called the annihilation of caste. David Hardiman has recently noticed this and commented on this to me, but I have no time to go into that. Let me repeat my formulaic description of the New International earlier in the essay: a single teacher's students flung out into the world and time, where the classroom is the model for the building of collectivity. Of late, I have thought of the task of an activist involvement with the historical by way of the humanities beyond the disciplines, taking the practice of learning as picking up a relay from the earlier historical texts. The real work of catching the relay in diverse ways and running with it is forever surprising, and it will come from a collectivity that is in the future anterior, beyond my grasp. I have understood Du Bois within a general understanding of history as relay, and here I quote from the message he left with his wife, Shirley Graham, in 1957, 6 years before his death, to be read out at his death. Here is a description of the relay. I quote Du Bois, "What I have done well will live long and justify my life. What I have done ill or never finished can now be handed on to others for endless days to be finished, perhaps better than I could have done. And that piece will be my applause." Let us close with such an item for a relay. It is the relationship between physiocracy and imperialism as reflected in the inspired study of the permanent settlement in a rule of property for Bengal, staging the physiocratic principles of Sir Philip Francis, by which agricultural policy was moved from farming to property, the rule of property. Recently, in connection with the new imperative to consider climate change, I had been teaching Marx's peculiar devotion to species life, where, and I quote Marx, "Nature is the human being's inorganic body, and he must remain in a standing process with it if he is not to die." This in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, notes taken when Marx is 25 and 26. In these manuscripts, he has an account of the transformation of subsistence farming into land as agricultural property in 15th century England, which is transferred almost unchanged to the chapter on so-called primitive accumulation in Capital Volume 1, written 20 years later. Primitive accumulation is the transformation of farming land into property, making way for mercantilism and finally industry. Here, Marx pays careful attention to physiocracy. Indeed, there is an entire section on physiocracy in Theories of Surplus Value. Marx's only problem with physiocracy is the theoretical status of ground rent. In the consideration of primitive accumulation, Marx's comments on imperialism as a hothouse way of advancing political economy, and his fragmented comments on the indigenous lack of interest in land acquisition can, I think, pick up a relay in Guha's rich account of how it goes wrong in colonialism and in the very last sentence of his second introduction in 1981. Also in post-coloniality. I want to pull this away from our physiocratic legacy, agribusiness as development, into undoing its seeming greening, land acknowledgement. I quote a typical land acknowledgement here, and then suggest the task of the relay in the future anterior. Here is today's typical land acknowledgement, undoing genocide and imperialism in a few words. I quote, "The Metropolitan Museum of Art is situated in Lenape-Hocking, homeland of the Lenape diaspora, and historically a gathering and trading place for many diverse native peoples who continue to live and work on this island of Mannahatta. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all indigenous communities, past, present, and future, for their ongoing and fundamental relationships to the region." End of quote. This is the Metropolitan Museum's land acknowledgement. It might not be enough in reparation for this statement to appoint the brilliant new associate curator, Patricia Marroquin Norby Urepacha, and to include Native American objects now defined as art. The Lenapes, like subaltern Africans, were multilingual, and Lenape itself is, like Yoruba, a collective singular name for a multiplicity. What is it simply to say, we are sitting on your land but we respect you. We are not speaking of open-air museums, Yosemite, etc., not of creating the artificial natural. At the end of Capital Volume 1, Karl Marx suggests, as I just have pointed out, that the capitalization of land gives so-called primitive accumulation, making industrial capitalism possible. Thus, allowing the, quote, Native American the same modernity as ourselves. This is Guha's teaching against the pre-political. In today's contested future, rather than propose sustainable tourism, I quote the World Monuments Heritage Fund, we should all learn to undo our minds, to realize that the world itself, ourselves as the world itself, and this is everyone, the world itself was imposed on commons. For this, one of our tasks, indicated by suggestions, for example, to the World Economic Forum and Comparative Education Society, I quoted before, is to impart to the subaltern indigenous a real sense of the cartographic world, rather than dwell on the fact that most indigenous languages have a word for world, but not for colonialism or decolonization and deconstruction. Let me give you a story at the end. In 1949, there was in Paris a grand celebration of the Congrès Mondial des Partisans de la Paix, the World Congress of the Partisans of Peace, headed by Joliot-Curie. Du Bois was most prominently present, president of the American delegation. He was 81. Present also was 26-year-old Ranajit Guha, with a few other Indian women and men, including Nirod Majumdar, Chitrabhanu's dad. From Partha Chatterjee, I know that, and I quote Partha, Ranajit Da was in Paris from 1947 to 1953 as the representative of the Communist Party of India on the Secretariat of the World Federation of Democratic Youth. As part of his job, he organized events and built networks in Eastern Europe, West Asia, and North Africa, and often traveled in these regions under false identities. He returned to India in 1953 and began teaching. He went to Beijing. Sorry, that is quite wrong. He went to Britain. He went to Britain in 1959 and spent much of his academic life teaching in Sussex. That's the end of Partha's email. We have, of course, no corroboration of his actual presence at Du Bois's speeches. But since Du Bois was an important presence there, a considerable international hero, one can imagine that there was at least a distant contact. As a comparativist, we have been taught from the earliest days that what we compare is affinity, not influence. I declare an affinity between William Edward Burghardt Du Bois and Ranajit Guha, and hope to be able to write more about that poetry of the future. Thank you.